Welcome to another episode of the Denison Forum. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum and host for this podcast. Today we're sitting down with a couple of guests. First of those is one of our own, Mark Legg, is Associate Editor for Denison Forum. And you've likely followed us, if you have read several of Mark Legg's articles on the Denison Forum website. He is a very prolific writer, deep thinker. We're coming together from various parts of the world, Dallas, East Texas, and all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Mark Legg, welcome to the podcast, and tell us a little bit about you and then introduce our guest, would you?
Happily. My name is Mark Legg. That's pretty key around here. Sometimes I'm known as Mark the Younger.
Yes, and Mark the Older here. Yep.
Yes, but I'm very excited to be on. I've been involved with Denison Forum for several years now, which is crazy to say already. I started out as an intern and then progressed there, and I've been very blessed by that. I've written quite a bit for the Denison Forum on various topics, and I've also been given the opportunity and very blessed to have been given that opportunity. Right now, I serve as the associate editor here, so I do a lot of things either from the administrative side all the way to writing and researching. My passion is for philosophy and the deepest things. So, Mark, you'll have to cut us off at some point because otherwise we could go for I could go for a long time picking Mark Sayer's brain. So, yes, I graduated from DBU with a degree in philosophy and biblical studies, and eventually I want to become a professor in philosophy. Although I love Denison Forum, I would love to stick around here. That's kind of my plans. With that being said, Mark Sayers, sir, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about your faith journey, and then kind of your mission in your ministry, because there's quite a few books that you've written. So we're also in the midst of that, curious about how you came about to writing so many of them and what drives you to do that.
Yeah, so I guess this probably the faith journey starts with my father came to faith from a sort of completely unchurched background, and so I was lucky to grow up in a Christian family. But I think really faith probably came alive for me. Probably was about 17. I think God was there, and I think I was a believer, but it was sort of in the background. But then, really, when I was sort of 16, really encountered some sort of mental health challenges, came quite sort of depressed. And then just sort of through surrendering my life in my final year of high school, that's when God really came alive to me. I went to college to study advertising, but it was actually interesting. In between the end of high school and the beginning of college, I spent some time actually in the US working in some sort of quite gang-affected urban areas, and it was just where God really spoke to me. And sort of like this call into ministry began. So I went back, kept studying, but then ended up leaving advertising and actually became an intern with the Salvation Army. So I was actually with the Salvation Army for some time, sort of doing ministry amongst the poor, and then worked at a church or Salvation Army Corps, as they're called, in downtown Melbourne in Burke Street. So that's sort of the beginning of, I guess, my faith journey. I never really intended to write on culture. I just was always interested about sort of culture, I guess culture and faith, and the intersection between the two is my interest. But I guess I just was always interested in the world and curious, I think, and curious how I had lots of unchurched friends, and just how I communicated with them was always something that was fascinating to me. And then just one day I was asked to write out of the blue, and just began to. So I first wrote for a magazine here in Melbourne called Shoot the Messenger, which is no longer around, which is really about culture and faith, and and then began to got invited to write, and then have been going since then. So I think this is my 8th book. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. You got to love a magazine called Shoot the Messenger.
Yes, yeah, it was a fun title.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your family before you jump into the big statements with big words that I'll be watching out for. All right.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your family and about your church.
Yeah. So I have three kids. My daughter Grace is 14. I've got twin boys who are 10, Billy and Hudson, and I'm married to Trudy. Trudy is actually involved in a national prayer ministry here in Australia, which is just sort of, she's was for a long time an occupational therapist, and then she was a teacher of the deaf. But yeah, God's just developed a real heart for prayer and connecting churches for prayer, and so that's what she does. And yeah, so my church is called Red Church. It's an interesting name. We were talking just before off air. People often ask where did this name come from. I did inherit it, but the church that when I came to the church, it was actually a network of congregations, and one of the guys spoke Spanish, and apparently I don't speak Spanish, but one of the words for net is red, and that was the origins of that name. But yeah, continually asked, what does this name mean? It's good for branding because you just make it red. It's very easy.
Make everything, yeah,
it's simple.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for introducing that. You've written quite extensively. I mean, you already said you've written 8 books. Is that right? This is your 8th?
Mm. Okay. Yeah, this is number 8, yeah.
Wow, okay. So it seems like quite a few of them discuss, as you already said, the intersection of faith and culture. And that's of a lot of interest to us because that's honestly the ministry that we're in, is this intersection of faith and culture, and how do we deal with the news on a day-to-day basis, and then how do we help believers adjust to that? Well, okay, I'll be completely honest. When I picked up your book, I don't know. I wasn't expecting it to be that good. and here's the only reason is because I knew nothing about you. I knew nothing about your ministry, but it was something we wanted to write a book review on, and I thought maybe I would get a few points out of it about leadership in this day and age as a Christian, things of that nature. But I was particularly interested in your assessment of the culture just from the get-go, because you spend a good portion of this leadership book talking about the culture, and it's clear you have a very polished message about where the Western culture is, particularly America, but also in all Western countries. And so I wrote in this book review that it's uniquely clear and straightforward for its insight. And so it's clear that that's been built up from the 7 other books that you've written. So let me ask you this. What caused you to write this particular book and about leadership, and how did you come to the conclusion, this kind of central point about the non-anxious presence being so important?
Yeah, my sense is that we were going through a significant cultural change. And I sort of had this sense that for the last few years, and, I'd been podcasting and writing and almost describing this world that we were sort of moving into, people were asking questions, what is it to live in a post-Christian society? Probably also the other interesting thing is being in Australia probably gives us a slightly unique vantage point. Like there's lots about Australia that's like America, but then there's bits which are different. There's lots about Australia that's like the United Kingdom and Europe, but it's slightly different. And so in a sense, you're part of the West, but you're also on the edge of the West. And Australia is very integrated with Asia now. So that was also interesting. So you see a lot of Asian culture, and particularly in my life, seeing the area I grew up in radically change through Chinese investment, Chinese culture, which initially was like, in a multicultural area. So, you see that when you're in a multicultural area with high migration, but then seeing the geopolitical implications of that, which is fascinating. So I just had this sense, probably in 2019, that a lot of what I'd been describing the world as this sense of how do we live in a post-Christian society? Everyone was asking me questions around, what does it look like if we've still got this progressive reality, and the culture in my cities and state is quite a progressive sort of place. But then I was like, oh my goodness, hang on. This is starting to go in different directions I did not anticipate. So that was really one of the root, I guess, presumptions. And then I think when COVID happened, it was an interesting break for everyone. But I think it gave me some space to stop and think, because I wasn't doing, traveling and doing the things that I did. And I just had a lot of conversations with people who I normally wouldn't have had the chance to go and travel. So early, 2020, I was doing Zoom calls with leaders from, people who I spoke to often. I spoke to a lot of people in the US and Europe, but then talking to people in India, Singapore, and then seeing almost the uniformity. So there's different things happen in every culture, but almost the uniformity of the world is radically changing, and seeing them all dealing with it. So it asked me, the question is, instead of just asking the question, what's happening in say, Western culture, I started asking the question, what's the broad global changes that we're going through, and how is that going to influence culture? So, for example, I began to see in my area, just in sort of 2018, 2019, the effects of the protests in Hong Kong became a culture war issue in my area, which I never expected. I don't live in China or Hong Kong, but there was posters. The Chinese, the Chinese national flag was flying over our police station and our town hall, because what happened was that you had the whole thing which you saw, which was you had people putting over government buildings the rainbow flag. So that was sort of like, I was thinking, how do we head into, we're heading to this new progressive reality. So that's a sign of it. But then what happened was sort of the local different groups, which Chinese community said, well, if there's a rainbow flag representing that community, we need to have our flag. And so when I saw that, I was like, hang on, this is different. This is not where I thought this would go. So I guess all those that's one example of a number of sort of senses I had that something bigger was happening, and how do we wrestle with that? I guess that's the essence. And you mentioned the non-anxious presence. I sensed there was just so much anxiety. When I spoke to people everywhere, there was a sense. I'd speak to people in the US and they talk about polarization, but then I remember talking to leaders in India, and they're talking about the direction of India and the Modi government and, Hindu nationalism and how that made them feel as Christians. And I thought, this is a different scenario, but the sense of anxiety is what everyone's feeling, that there's rapid change. We don't understand it. The world doesn't look like it did 3 years ago. How do we deal with this? So the term non-anxious presence is from a rabbi and family therapist called Edwin Freeman, who wrote a book called A Failure of Nerve. And his argument is that to lead, you need to come from this non-anxious posture. And that's what people are looking for. So that was putting geopolitics and the big changes in the world. And then, well, how on earth do you lead in this is I guess the two components of the book.
Right.
Hey, Mark, if I could jump in here for just a second, I'm just curious. A thought comes to mind is it's a little counterintuitive when I was reading through some of your book, and I'm sure we can get to this in various ways, but so many things that you start talking about, well, what generates all this anxiety? Okay. The rapid pace of change. And if things weren't changing as much as they were, COVID brings in this reality of unbelievable change that we've only kind of read about in some history books, but never something on this scale. I've always kind of felt like the good and the bad of the pandemic was that it happened everywhere, and that it wasn't just in one place where we could kind of ignore it if it wasn't our place, but there was this sense of, okay, well, we are kind of really all in this together now in a way that we've never been before. But then in your book, you point out that communication on the scale that we have it now actually breeds more anxiety. Can you kind of speak to that a minute? Because a lot of times we would have thought intuitively, no, wait, if we can communicate with each other, that'll be a good thing. That will help us to navigate whatever's coming. But to your point in the book, it is having the opposite effect. And Mark just wrote a great article for our website about doom scrolling and being so aware of everything that's happening in the world, that all of this global communication coming at us at one time actually breeds an unbelievable amount of anxiety in us. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
I think early on, some of the utopian promise of the internet was that, if we can all just talk, everything will be okay. The reality of how we're seeing this is that when humans are connected in larger groups, we become more attuned to negative emotions. So, for example, that just say you're in a movie theater and you're sitting there and it's a packed movie theater. If 20 people stood up and started screaming and ran out of the movie theater, even if nothing was happening, the chances are you're going to be running out of that movie theater because there's something infectious about fear and negativity. Gossip. I was talking to a pastor of a large church in Melbourne a few years ago, and he talked about the fact that they had this incredible moment. I think it's like 12 people from an unreached people group who'd migrated to Melbourne came to faith. Incredible story, And then they also had this thing where one of the leaders had a moral failing. And he said to me, the moral failing, pretty much everyone in a church of thousands knew with probably in 24 hours. They had to have this whole program to communicate the good news of these people being saved. And there's something that, you hear gossip, it goes. And I think what's happened is as the internet has become monetized, and early on, people struggle to believe that now, but early on, one of the questions with early internet culture was, how do we monetize this? Because everything's free. And you think like Napster, everyone was just getting free music and back in the days. And one of the ways they found to monetize it, particularly through social media, was that negative emotions go viral. And anger and jealousy and envy and negativity is something viral to it. It's almost like COVID. It just spreads. And I think that what we've seen is as the world's been connected, that's happened. Secondly, the area of our responsibility has changed. There's something about, I remember a number of years ago, maybe it was 5 years ago, there was a terrorist bombing at, I think it was Istanbul airport. I think it was an ISIS bombing. And I remember seeing the news and it was a person on their phone talking that this had just happened. And I remember seeing the fear in their face. You could see the explosion, they're running out. And I remember thinking, as a human, that is so much more capturing of me because humans are relational. We see faces. Whereas if I'd read that in the New York Times in a well-written article, I would not have the same emotional connection with that. That's happening all the time now. We are just bombarded by this emotive, it's almost like virtual reality in a sense. You're almost living it when you see these videos. So I think that's just spreading and spreading. And I think there was a bit of naivety. I think one of the Christian tenets is the doctrine of original sin, that by just connecting everyone, everything's going to be great. It just doesn't work like that. It gives a chance for good things to spread, and good things do spread. But also, we're connected to the sin and brokenness of the world. We're aware of it in a way and experience it in ways that we didn't in the past.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I was just about to go there and ask you about how that connects to original sin, because the first thing that came up to me is there's a lot of talk, even in the secular world, about how this is doing so much damage and how connectivity is maybe not as great as we thought it was. But there's that original connection of whenever we have a promise of a utopia, we should always be very, very skeptical or just maybe reject it outright. But as Christians, because we know about that doctrine, or, honestly, just that people are broken. If we're just going to simplify it, that's the baseline, what the Bible's communicating. We're broken. And so there's a lot more of a chance for that to spread. So I guess, do you think, so you've talked about how this kind of destabilizing effect is global. And so there is that geopolitically, as you talked about, there's all these concerns about nationalism from here all the way to India and all across the world. Let me ask, you talk a little bit about how there are software changes that happen on computers, and societies throughout time have these software changes where it's like, okay, these things are changing. Maybe the political side is changing a bit. We have a new party, maybe things like of that nature. But we're going through a hardware change. And I thought that was a pretty compelling example. I just switched from a Windows computer to a Mac, and I can speak to there's some differences there. So let me ask you that, can you unpack that change? Why is that happening? Where do you see that coming from?
I was about 4 or 5 years ago, I was walking through Melbourne at night. At that stage, Melbourne had won the world's most livable city award for multiple years in a row. And I'd come from a soccer game, and I was coming to this packed stadium, and I'm walking through the city, and there's just restaurants filled with people. There was a basketball game on, another football game. There was some massive concert with Taylor Swift or something. And I'm walking through this city, and I'm just going, this is unbelievable. I totally get why some people, if you're 27 and you're in this place, why do you need God? You got all these options, it's all around you. And I remember thinking, as a minister, I'm battling this. I'm not like battling some great crisis in the culture. It's like everything seemed too good. And I think part of what I felt at that time was this is just going to keep getting better. The world's going to keep improving. Technology will get better. The world will get smoother. And I think it was around 2018, 2019, I just noticed even international travel got easier. Like I could use my Uber in Melbourne, in Los Angeles, in London. I remember running out of, like sometimes when you're traveling, you haven't done a wash, you need to buy a shirt, you've spilled something, buying a shirt, and you're just walking into Uniqlo and going, I looked at that one in Melbourne the other week. I'm now in London. I'll get that exact same shirt for the same money. So the world was becoming this super smooth place. And part of my argument was that's what's creating a sense of lived secularism. And so some of the ways which we've argued about secularism and post-Christianity rightly is around the battle of ideas. And I 100% believe in that. But I just began to see, hang on, there's a structural reality as well. And I remember thinking, if I took some of these people in Melbourne and I dumped them in rural Afghanistan, in a village where they were having to live under the Taliban, how would their lives change? How would their worldview change? And I realized that a lot of our worldview is actually shaped by this structural reality. And then I began to realize, what if some of the things changed? Like the thing I noticed, there was one of the things I found fascinating was when 9/11 happened in Melbourne, on the other side of the world, we saw a bump in church attendance for a couple of months. Like that's fascinating. Like we didn't get attacked.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't our country. Why? Because the bubble of this safe, controlled world got popped, and people saw Americans who they thought looks like them. We're seeing the same thing with Ukraine. Like people are seeing, the thing of people who look, like innocent. I remember seeing this thing of this young, I think it's like a young barista art student, and he was lining up because all men had been called up, and him just saying, a week ago, I never thought I would fight in a war, but here I am. I'm now signing up. You see that, it's arresting, because it's like, what was that? What if that was me?
Yeah.
So what we saw happening with COVID is you realize that this world that creates this environment for secularism that we've experienced in the West, if you tweaked a few things, it would start to go off. And we've lived in the world's globalization system has lived out of this on a number of things. It's lived on American power because the US military has enabled the sea lanes of the world to operate, and we can fly planes. And it's also been on just-in-time manufacturing where, I was talking to a builder here, and he said, he could order something and a piece of timber in China within a week could come to his building site. He just, whatever he wants, I thought, hang on, if a few things just went off here, this system would start to short circuit a bit. And then COVID began to do that. Like we saw in COVID, there were places where people only really locked down for like 6 weeks. And I've spoken to pastors in US states who had a very short lockdown, then had very few rules after that, and they lost a third of their church. And I'm just like, wow, fascinating. All you have to do is change a couple dials of the system. So I think my argument is I think we do need to keep talking about ideas and the battle of ideas. That's really important, worldview. But I realize that I think that what we're going through is not just ideas. We're actually going through a significant structural change in the world. And, we're seeing this. I read an article last night by the English historian Dominic Sandbrook, who said the golden age of travel may be over. A cheap flight to Mexico, and you can get and fill your tank with gas and drive to see your relatives 4 states away. He's like, what if that's over? No one's thought about that. And if the options come down, food prices more expensive. You can't go to that cool cafe and have your avocado on toast because it's just really expensive. It's going to change how people see the world. I'm not saying it's going to cause some massive revival and everyone's going to fall on their knees and say, oh, we need God, because I don't think it's a full crisis. But it's a dialing down of our expectations about life. And we're seeing, I think, a more realistic thing around life. So one final thing, the thing that struck me when the Ukraine conflict began was how many people from hipsters in Kiev to people in Europe saying, I can't believe this is happening in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you say there's wars happening all over the world, what made us think that in our special controlled system that we created called the developed world, that we wouldn't have wars anymore?
Yeah.
That's an idol that just got exposed. And there's a structural change happening in the world. And I think seeing that is really key.
I know, and I can kind of affirm what you're saying, because over the weekend I was talking with a friend who has about 10 years left, 10, 12 years left of his working career. And he was thinking about making some pretty significant decisions, and even the purchase of a possible retirement location. And he said, we were talking about why he wanted to do this, move away from a major population center here in the U.S., move into a rural environment. And he says, look, I've seen things in the last couple of years I never thought I would see. One of them in particular being scarcity on the shelf at the grocery store. I never thought in America, in this modern world, that I would go to a grocery store and not find everything and anything that I wanted immediately and abundantly there. And it's just got me thinking that the way the world has been doesn't necessarily mean that's the way it's going to be. And maybe the best thing that I could do long term is to be as simple in my life as I could be, and having little or no debt, and being as self-sustaining as I could be. And I had a professor one time who said, if you look at the biblical account, every time Israel went to the big city, they got in trouble.
Sure, that's interesting.
And there's something to that idea, right? But it's an interesting thing. Is what if our world doesn't have as many options in it as we've come to expect that are always going to be there?
There's a sense of absolute security, absolute abundance that makes it seem like we don't need God as a fortress. We have the greatest military in the world, and I think we've had that sense of security for a long time now. 9/11 did shake things up, culturally speaking, but at the same time, at least in my generation, I feel that that sense of security is very strong still. And I wonder, Mark, I know you've done a lot of thinking about this, so I was just reading a book. It's a bit of an older book. It's called The Next Evangelicalism by Soong-Chan Rah, and he has discussed how he thinks a big source of where the church's strength will be. I mean, he's talking specifically in America, but in general, in the West as well, that a lot of strength can come from immigrant communities who are believers or who come to Christ, because there is a sense of there's a connection to the Bible that they have in their need. There's this sense of insecurity and like uprooting, with some of them with hardly any money, coming to a completely new country where you don't speak the language. What does that look like? What does church look like for them? And he discussed how a lot of immigrant churches are, there's a lot more face-to-face kind of ministry happening. There's a lot more, and you said that you started your ministry kind of in the thick of it, right? At Salvation Army. So thinking about how kind of the face-to-face service hardship Christianity that we see in that. Do you see that in Australia, like as you said, with a lot more immigration, and does that connect to how we're seeing a revival of Christianity in Asian countries? Right. And so I'm just wondering if you can connect those dots.
I mean, Australia is a very secular country, and I was stunned when I worked with people who lived on the streets in Australia, how almost all of them having spiritual conversations was so easy, and how so many of them had a faith of some kind. And that was really interesting for me to encounter. I was in the UK recently and spent some time with a ministry called Elam Ministries, who's a ministry working with Iranian people in the Iranian diaspora and the underground church in Iran. And I just sat and listened to stories that were just incredible. It was like hearing stories from the early church, And we are seeing a I would call it a revival amongst the Iranian people, who have been traditionally, in the last sort of couple of centuries, Iran's been a really hard to reach country. But then in 1979, you had the Iranian Revolution, and you had many people travel around the world, become displaced, and God's worked in incredible ways. We have at our church Iranian asylum seekers who literally on a boat between Indonesia and Australia and having like visions of Jesus, out in the water. There's never there's stories you don't hear often in secular countries, and this is something I think about being displaced, about being insecure, which our need, and our absolute realization of our lack of our own power and ability to achieve things and have things leads us to God. In Australia, we also have a points-based immigration system, which is basically, I guess, weighted towards wealthier migrants as well. So it's interesting, we have lots of very wealthy migrants who come from India and China and these places, and you don't always see that need there. So I think it's maybe less about migration as it is about need, financial need, structural need. Sure. But I think there's a really key point in that so much of this is, how do we attune ourselves to the opportunities to come as scarce? We move from possibly a culture of abundance to a culture of scarcity. And again, too, I don't think it's going to be like, we're heading towards, becoming, underdeveloped nations. Yeah, exactly. It's more, yeah, exactly. But it's more that we have had generations who are just grown up with, I expect to have everything at the click of a button. And when that doesn't happen, what sort of, opportunities does discipleship and evangelistic does that raise for us?
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Yep. So Mark, you talk a little bit in your most recent book about confusion being one of the biggest reality symptoms, and that's characteristic of, I think it was Francis Schaeffer or C.S. Lewis, maybe both of them talked about, if you happen to be living at one of the times when, at what they call the hinge moments of history, you may be standing at a place where God does one of those most amazing things, but if you're not living or standing at that moment of one of those big hinge points, that doesn't make your life any less. But you do talk about how we're moving in this, that we are in this gray zone between what has been and what will be. Can you kind of unpack that and the characteristic of confusion? I think one of the things that I think is really most helpful in reading your book and also in doing podcasts like this is to help people kind of understand and be able to define their reality so that it can be more comprehensible to them. And when it is more comprehensible, it's less scary, right? And they can see what they're dealing with. I think that's really one of the big values of your book, is to be able to frame things for people to have a lens to look through. Okay, I'm not the only one that's confused. I'm not the only one that feels disoriented. Why is that? Why does it seem to be that way? And how did it get that way so fast? Can talk about this gray zone a little bit and what we've been and where we're going.
Well, sort of when I started thinking about this book, I was almost like hoping I could come up with a new name for the new era. Like I felt we're entering into a new era. Oh, great, I can name that, and then, I'll have named the new era, and there'll be all these books about how do we do ministry in the new era, whatever I called it. And then I began to realize, hang on, I don't know exactly what's emerging. Like you can see elements of what's emerging. You can see technology. You can see when the metaverse was announced, it was interesting because a lot of people saying, oh, this is going to be the future and we're going to live in a metaverse. But there's others I don't think it's going to happen. I'm like, hang on, where are we going to the metaverse or aren't we? And, I began to realize that what was actually happening was we weren't entering into a new era. We were entering into the period that's a corridor between eras. A quote from the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy in the Financial Times at the beginning of the pandemic, and she said this fascinating line, which stuck with me, was pandemics are the portals between worlds. And I was like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
And I listened to a couple of podcasts and read a book on the Spanish flu and how much the Spanish flu did change things. And it ended up being sort of this, and from the end of World War One into what began, the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. And so I began to realize that actually what was happening. So to give you an example, I was in London last few weeks, and I've been to London a lot, love the city, and I was fascinated. What is post-COVID London like? And you got there, and in many ways, I got there on the Jubilee weekend, so it seemed full of people. I thought, oh, this seems like old London. But then you go, oh, that store's not there anymore. That's changed. But then in the second week when we were there, and the Jubilee crowds went away, it was like, wow, this is quiet. I'm on the tube midweek on a Monday morning, and there's an empty carriage in the underground. This is not normal. So it's like, I'm in London, but it's like slightly off. And I have that sense. I go to Melbourne downtown, and there's all these stores closed, and there's more homeless people, and something's changed here, but it's not fully, like, I'm still here. I can recognize things, but something's changed. And you feel that about the world. You watch sports and it's still sports, but hang on, it's changed a bit. And I had this sense that we're actually in this period where a gray zone is a term I took from actually a term that was used around the first Russian incursion into Ukraine, where people asked the question, is this a war or isn't it? You had these, they called them the little green men, turned up at all these military installations in the Donbass and Crimea. There was cyber attacks. There was information warfare, but it wasn't like a full war. Like in the past, it was clear we're at war, we're not at war. This was something in between. And I realize that's very characteristic of the world now. So in a gray zone, you've got one era ending. So you still see some characteristics of it. And you've got another era emerging, but it's not fully formed. And you're living with both. So that creates confusion because the markers which you look for to find a sense of place and understanding, we call eras by certain names. We talk about the Victorian era in Britain because it was marked by Queen Victoria, who created this order, and there's a clear sense of this is what everything was. But we're now between orders. So it's this very confusing place to live in. But I think once you understand that we're in a transitional point, it becomes clearer. And that is a marker of how to understand our place. Something's ending, something's beginning, but it's like the sun setting and rising on two different horizons at the same time.
And confusion it's not very far to leap from confusion to fear. I mean, in many ways, they're kind of the same thing. It's darkness is very, makes people afraid because you don't know what's in the dark. So we're in this time. I think it's really helpful to think about it like that, like a gray zone where we're in between. You talk about, this is a great quote. I if you don't mind, I pulled it from your book. It says, God's presence turns an unformed wilderness into a garden of growth, of holy growth. And I've been thinking a lot about how God takes, because we might think this is a very unique struggle of ours, of a 21st century. But then I think back to biblical stories of the Israelites who were under existential threats from nations much larger than them all the time throughout the Old Testament. And so we have a framework to view not only us an existential crisis as a people, as a culture, because the Israelites were going through that all the time. And so we're also went through the wilderness. And so you talk about the wilderness too. And so we just know that our God is a God who makes beautiful things and new things out of existential crises, out of fear and confusion. And so as people are in this state, first of all, kind of generally, we can't predict how the Lord or the Holy Spirit is going to move, but how do you see churches following through that and saying, okay, we know we're in confusion. We know we're in this lane between eras. Have you seen churches step up to take advantage of that, and how have they done that?
Yeah, I think that you're hitting the essence of one of the things I was trying to do in this book, which was reframe this moment. And one thing I noticed, I talked to a lot of pastors in 2020 and 2021 on Zoom around the world, and what I noticed was very marked by, here's what I can't do. I can't meet at the moment because of the government restrictions, or people haven't come back, or I can't get the volunteers that I had, or it was all what I don't have. But it's interesting. I also would hear these things where they might throw at the end of the conversation, oh, but you know what? It's so much easier to talk about Jesus. I'm having conversations, at the school gate or something. And, our team
Right.
saw that. Like in Melbourne, people having spiritual conversations everywhere. People were reassessing their lives, Yes, there were people who walked away from church, but we've had people who were super flaky on the edge of our church who are now completely switched on for Jesus because they went through this life reassessment. And, I'm like, I try and say to people, it'd be almost like I don't want to minimize what's happened with COVID and everything or what's happening in the world, but in a sense, perhaps a worse fate was as everything just got better and better and better. And people like one of the big trends that people were talking about in church was people are coming less and less regularly. There's one denomination which is I know of, which is redefining regular attendance from every 2 weeks to every 6 weeks. What a nightmare! Like, how do you disciple people who come every 6 weeks? Putting their kids in sport over church is becoming more and more normal. And so I thought, hang on, what if this is actually an opportunity? And you mentioned the wilderness there. If you think about Israel's wilderness experience was in between Egypt and the Promised Land. And that in-between space was a time of incredible preparation where God did so much to the people of God. He created a remnant. He took them really on this sense of discipleship and formation. And I also was inspired by the life of David. David, all the wonderful things we see about David, his Psalms, his defeat of Goliath, it all comes from the formation he had, looking after the flock in the wilderness. So I was like, let's reframe this, and in answer to your question, I don't see, this sounds bad, I don't see heaps of churches really grabbing this moment. There is a lot of stuff happening. Like I know, like in our area, perhaps the churches haven't worked as well as always before this, but it was quite amazing. In our church, we had a long lockdown here in Melbourne, and one of the amazing things that happened, that the churches in this area began to pray together. My wife organised a prayer walk, so we couldn't meet, but people could walk. You could have your daily walk. We had over 500 people from different churches walking our local area praying. Like, we've never seen that. We had one church which became the centre of food collection, and the police came to the churches and said, "How can we help? We're going to people. We can go to houses, and we're encountering all these people in need. Can the churches give us food packs to give to doors?" So we had all these churches working together, praying, getting food, and the police partnering with the church to give to the poor. Like, amazing stuff happening, in the midst of it. So I think I saw that and I thought, hang on, there's advantages here. Let's reframe this moment. There's a lot that's out of our control. I have no control over the war in Ukraine apart from prayer. But what can we do? We're the people of God, and these are the moments that we're actually built for. Let's reframe the opportunities. Let's not see what we can't do. Let's see then the creativity that then creates when you're limited. Limits create creativity and innovation.
A good word. That's a good word.
Yeah, I was just reading the other day in Hebrews as I was preparing for this. It stuck out to me from that reading. It was Hebrews 12. It says, "Let's be grateful for receiving a kingdom that can't be shaken." And that was an encouragement to me, because no matter how much we shake around, that's an opportunity to show how unshakable and eternal the kingdom is. So maybe just one final question here is, why, we touched on this, but why non-anxious presence? So, you spoke about how we want leaders in the midst of this, obviously not to be anxious, but what about that in particular communicates the gospel? How does that connect back to our faith?
Yeah, so non-anxious presence comes from Edwin Freeman, who was a family therapist, and he was a rabbi and a family therapist, and he worked with families, and he noticed that often the person who would bring healing in a dysfunctional family was not necessarily the father or the mother or the authority figures. It was the person, it could even be a child, who was the least anxious in an anxious system. And he said that what would happen is they would, by being calm, by not playing into all the games, that slowly, and if they could bring healing through being that non-anxious presence. And he came up with a leadership theory, which was that it's not actually charisma or height or accolades or achievements which make someone a leader. It's actually the fact that they can present something not anxious. Like, I talk about in the book, if you were, say, at a town hall meeting and the mayor and the officials of the city were at the front, and all of a sudden someone screamed fire, and the mayor and the officials who at the beginning of the meeting looked like the authority, if they started crying and rolling around on the ground, if someone up the back said, okay, everyone, that's the exit, let's calmly leave, at that point, that person becomes the leader, because they're like, non-anxiousness in this moment. And they could just literally be, a 12-year-old high school girl with no positional power.
Sure.
And I think that's something that is really key. Now, he then has, a whole theory in his book, A Failure of Nerve, which, I really found incredibly compelling. One thing I had a little bugbear with was there's an element when you read it. His argument is that what will happen is when you're a non-anxious presence, it will bring healing, but you're going to face backlash. You'll have people who don't like the fact that you're being non-anxious. They want to envelop you in their fear. And he talks about triangulation, that people find in anxious moments a sense of solace when other people join them in that. Like, after a meeting, like, what did you feel about that meeting? Were they a bit off? Oh, you too. And all of a sudden at the water cooler, you got 3 people, it becomes 4, and then all of a sudden anxiety flows through the system like a virus. So he said the leader can be a non-anxious presence and a healing presence by resisting then the second wave of sabotage that comes. Now, I 100% agree with that theory. I've lived it. It's hard. It's so hard, and the conversations I had with pastors, I had heartbreaking conversations with pastors whose churches fully became toxic in the last 2 years, and their families were ostracized. Their kids experienced it at school. People stopped talking to people. Really, really hard to do that. And so I love Edwin Freeman's contribution that he's brought. I think there's so much there. But what I realized is I can't do that in my own strength. Like, I can't resist that, and as the world gets more into a gray zone, I think polarization, all this stuff, it's really difficult. But what I realized is what I can be a non-anxious presence with God's presence. So I think that was the missing part that Freeman doesn't, add to his. So I want to say, yes, Freeman has a really valuable insight here, but it's actually our faith which roots us in Christ that enables us. It's in his strength and not ours. He's our protector. He did say we're going to experience persecution. He did say, it's sort of come even divide families. And so my encouragement is when we face backlash, I think the days of saying to leaders, hey, if you do this 10 things from the business world, that's all you're going to make you a successful leader. They're helpful, but ultimately you're going to face backlash increasingly. Like the tribalization and toxic stuff is not going away next year. It's going to be around, I think, for a period here. So how do we lead as non-anxious presence in that? But I see that as an opportunity that forces me back to God, forces me away from my proficiencies to his. And so that's a moment for renewal for leaders. And that's what I'm saying to leaders in this moment. Yes, it's hard. It's probably much harder than it was 5 years ago. But there's an opportunity for us to be more centered on God. And just quickly to end, I did a thing a couple of years ago where I just read as many biographies of Christian leaders who are turnaround moments, and when they managed to like be a vessel for God and those hinge moments. I could not find one where they did not get to a point of coming to the end of themselves and sort of collapsing and God using them. And that's there for us. We have that opportunity to turn to God in moments of great cultural tumult.
Which, greatly said. I think that just how important it is to spend time with God daily and to make sure that you're consistently connected to Scripture, to the Word of God, more than you're connected to the news media and the news stream. That's got value to it, and we all need to be aware in various ways, but there needs to be a healthy limit to that, and we need to do all that we can to be more aware of the activity of God and of the presence of God, both in history and in the present. And then I would also say, Mark, that get around other people of faith, and wherever you get to be that person of non-anxious presence, you can actually be contagious. Just like fear is contagious, faith can be contagious, right? Yes. And if you're spending that time with God and you're building your confidence in Him, then let that be contagious to the people around you, and look for those people that can also be encouraging and contagious to you. And that's how we give testimony to the kingdom. That's how we give testimony to the presence of God, even in this uncertain moment. And I think that may be the key descriptor, right? Is that we're living in a time of uncertainty, but we have the Spirit of God, we have the Word of God, we have the fellowship of God's people, and we can lean on and into those things. And we may not know, we've never really known everything about where we were going. The people, as the founder of our ministry says, nobody in the Bible got a 5-year plan, right? But what we do have is a very present help in time of trouble. We have the Spirit of God with us all the time. And how can we hold hands with Him and with each other and walk by faith as He leads us? So thank you, Mark, for taking some time with us. It looks like tomorrow is going to be a good day because, well, you're already in tomorrow.
Yes.
And maybe the next time we talk, you can explain how it can be tomorrow when it's not tomorrow yet. But
yes,
that's the advantage of living in Australia, right?
Yes, living the future.
Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for your book. Again, if you're looking for a great read, it's Mark Sayers, A Non-Anxious Presence. And we hope you'll pick it up and that it'll be a blessing to you. And Mark, we look forward to talking with you again. And thank you for being a part of the Denison Forum podcast.
Oh, absolute pleasure. It's been great fun. Thank you so much.